Hawkeye has about a million different arrows, and he's got a sonic arrow capable of taking down radioactive man. He's got explosive arrows strong enough to stagger the Hulk, and acid arrows that can eat right through the hull of a car. But for every awesome arrow, there's usually an equally lame one. And today, we're going to take a look at some of my favorites, some of the lamest arrows from Hawkeye's quiver. First up, let's talk about the water arrow. It's just what it sounds like, an arrow that unleashes water from its tip. Now, this might seem like a good idea in the right environment. Having just a bit of water would be enough to complicate electricity-themed villains' plans. If Hawkeye were to take on Electro, for example, that water-tipped arrow might actually deliver a devastating punch. But in other fights, like his duel with his evil brother Barney Barton, a water arrow is pretty pathetic. Next, there's Hawkeye's expandable BUZZSAW arrow. Now, this is my favorite one to make fun of. This one is lame because it is just so classically old-school comic booky cheesy. It just reeks of the terrible storylines where heroes would magically produce the most convoluted gadgets in order to defeat their villains. In this particular instance, Hawkeye was fighting a giant cactus, and instead of hitting it with a traditional arrowhead or even an explosive arrow, of which he had many, he decided the best way to defeat his enemy was to use a buzzsaw arrow. Because, fighting an animated cactus was obviously something that Clint was so worried about that he prepared for the fight by making a special arrow. Another particularly lame arrow that I want to mention today is Hawkeye's grounding arrow. And it does exactly what you'd imagine in case Hawkeye is ever updating the electrical wiring in his home or fighting against an electricity-powered villain. He can shoot an arrow into the ground to ground himself, preventing any shock or damage that he might get. Now, this last arrow is by far the lamest one, and I'm really excited to tell you about it because Hawkeye has a bouncy landing pad arrow. That's right, he basically just has a gigantic mattress stored in the tip of one of his arrows. Whenever Hawkeye jumps from a great height, he can shoot this arrow at the ground, and like an inflatable raft from a boat, it will suddenly fill with air. He used this while getting chewed out by Captain America, and this was actually a pretty interesting scene. While Cap was telling Clint that he was hoping he could promote him to a team leader of a new Avengers squad, the pair leapt off a roof, and Clint seamlessly shot an arrow towards the ground. A giant brown mat popped up, and both he and Cap bounced on it, then quickly continued running on the street below. All the while, Captain America was expressing his disappointment with Clint and how he didn't think Clint would ever be able to lead any of the Avengers teams. Because Clint Barton is basically the irresponsible hothead of the comic book Avengers, basically like their version of the Human Torch for those of you more familiar with Fantastic Four. Now, while Hawkeye does have his fair share of lame arrows, he does have some cool ones. Namely, he's got an adamantium arrow that's pretty deadly and a vibranium arrow that easily incapacitated one of Ultron's weapons. I'll be telling you about those in a different video, so keep an eye out for those. But I was really excited just to get this one out. Lame arrows, lame weapons are one of my favorite things to talk about, and it's easily one of the best things to make fun of in the comic book shop when you go in. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you want to see next. Again, I'm going to be pumping out a lot more of these videos, a lot more often, so I'm pretty excited.